3 weeks. That was how long Eleanor Voss had been at Blackwood Hall, before she understood that no one there was going to help her. The hall itself was not the problem. It was vast and cold in the manner of all great houses that have outlived the families who built them. 37 rooms, a library that ran the full length of the east wing, and grounds that sloped toward a gray lake no one seemed to use. The problem was the people arranged inside it, each one certain of their position relative to every other, and equally certain that Eleanor's position was somewhere below the threshold of their attention. She had arrived on a Thursday morning in October, 6 years after her father died and 3 weeks after the solicitors had finally settled what remained of his estate. What remained was not much: a letter of wardship, signed by the 5th Duke of Blackwood, a distant arrangement contracted when Eleanor was 12 and her father was still solvent, and a standing offer of residence at Blackwood Hall until she either married or turned 25. She was 3 months from that birthday. She had come, therefore, not because she wished to, but because the alternative was a small room in Bath, with an aunt who disapproved of her economy, and Eleanor could not afford to be disapproved of. The evening she arrived, a dinner party was in full motion. She had not known there would be one. The solicitor's letter had said simply to present herself before the 4th of the month, and she had. No one had thought to mention Lord and Lady Harcastle, Sir Frederick Wynne, the Misses Dunmore, and approximately 20 additional guests who filled the dining room with the particular brightness of people who were used to being surrounded by beauty and had arranged themselves accordingly. Every chandelier in the room was lit. The table was dressed with hothouse flowers, white roses and something amber Eleanor did not know the name of, arranged at intervals so precise they appeared decorative rather than organic. The women wore silk of various shades that caught the light differently with each small movement. There was a hum of conversation that had been running for hours, effortless and exclusive as a clockwork mechanism, self-sustaining once wound. And at the edge of all that ordered brilliance, standing in the corridor outside the dining room with a candle, because no one had shown her to her rooms, was Eleanor Voss. She was not wearing silk. She was wearing the gray wool dress she had traveled in, which was respectable and warm and entirely wrong, and she was holding in her left hand a small leather case that contained everything she had thought worth carrying, and in her right hand she held the candle, because the corridor was dim and the footman who had opened the front door had vanished after saying he would fetch someone, which he had not done. She stood there for 11 minutes, she counted. A man emerged from the dining room, not a footman, not a butler, but someone whose bearing made both those offices seem approximate. He was tall and dressed in black, with a white cravat and no decoration except a single signet ring on his left hand. He did not look around the corridor the way a host surveying his domain might. He moved through it as though the corridor were a task he was completing. He saw her. He stopped. He looked at her not the way the footman had looked at her, with the calculating assessment of someone measuring what category of person she represented, but with something quieter and more attentive than that. The look of someone who had registered an anomaly and was not yet certain what to make of it. "You are Miss Voss," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. He looked at the candle in her right hand and the case in her left, and a small, precise observation crossed his face and was gone. "Someone should have shown you to your rooms," he said. "I apologize for that." He turned and summoned a footman by the simple mechanism of looking toward the end of the corridor, in a way that made the footman appear immediately. He gave a brief instruction in a voice too low for Eleanor to hear. Then he looked back at her. "You will have dinner sent up," he said, "and whatever else you need." He did not ask what she needed. He turned and went back into the dining room, and Eleanor stood in the corridor a moment longer with her candle, and thought that she had just met the Duke of Blackwood, and that he had looked at her as though she were something he intended to understand. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like welcome. She picked up her case and followed the footman up the stairs. Eleanor had been managing things for 6 years. It had not been her plan. Her plan, insofar as a girl of 19, recently bereaved, recently confronted with the full mechanical weight of her father's debts, had been to find a position as a governess or a companion, something that used the education she had been given, and asked nothing of her that she had not been trained for. That plan had not survived contact with the circumstances. Her father's estate was a middle-sized property in Wiltshire called Marsh End. It was not grand. It had 14 rooms, and a home farm, and a modest income from let fields that her father, in the last 4 years of his life, had quietly leveraged against a series of loans that Eleanor had not known about until the solicitor placed the ledger in front of her and asked her to confirm the figures. She confirmed them. Then she asked for a week. In that week, she read every entry in the ledger. She identified 3 categories of debt: immediate, deferrable, and contested. She wrote to each creditor separately, with a different letter for each category. To the immediate creditors, she offered a schedule of payment. To the deferrable ones, an explanation and a proposed term. To the contested ones, 3 entries in which she believed her father had been charged twice for the same obligation. She wrote a precise and documented objection with the supporting correspondence attached. 2 of the 3 contested debts were withdrawn. The third went to arbitration and was reduced by half. She was 19 years old. The solicitor, a man named Mr. Parrish who had known her father for 30 years, looked at her letters, and then looked at her, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Voss, your father's affairs were in a considerably more complicated condition than I had represented to you." "I know," she said. "I read the ledger." She had managed the estate for 6 years. Not as its owner, the entail passed to a cousin in Dorset who never visited, but as the person who was actually there, actually speaking to the tenant farmers, actually reviewing the quarterly accounts, actually identifying in the spring of her 22nd year that the wool merchant who contracted with the home farm had been adjusting his weight calculations in a manner that cost them £19 annually, and writing him a letter that resulted in a corrected contract and a retroactive settlement of £54 for the 3 years prior. The cousin in Dorset sent a brief note thanking her for her attention to the property. He did not ask how she had noticed. He did not ask how she had negotiated the settlement. He signed the note with a flourish and went back to whatever occupied him in Dorset. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Eleanor had understood this for a long time. She had simply decided, somewhere around her 21st year, that she was not going to be made less by it, not smaller, not quieter, not more grateful for the invisibility than the work deserved. She would do what needed to be done, she would do it well, and she would keep her own record of it, because no one else was going to. She kept her records in a small set of leather-bound notebooks, 1 per year, written in the margins as much as in the lines, because paper was not cheap and she was not wasteful. They contained everything: the creditor negotiations, the tenant agreements, the wool merchant figures, the seasonal labor costs, the decisions she had made and the reasons she had made them. They were not a diary, they were an account. There had been one moment, in the 3rd year of managing Marsh End, when she had sat down at the estate desk in the early morning, with the accounts spread before her, and thought, simply and completely, that she could not do it. Not that it was too difficult, not that she lacked the skill, but that the effort of being invisible was its own kind of weight, separate from the work itself, and that morning it had pressed down on her in a way that was harder than anything in the ledger. She had sat with that thought for approximately 4 minutes. She had registered it as true. Then she had picked up her pen and returned to the column she had been checking, because the column needed to be checked, and she was the only one who was going to do it, and she had decided long ago that she was not going to become less than she was, simply because no one was watching. Her father had watched, once. In the last years of his life, when the loans were accumulating and she did not know it, he had still looked at her with the particular attention of a man who understood that he had produced something he had not quite expected. He had taught her himself, the accounts, the correspondence, the structure of a creditor agreement, not because he planned for her to need it, but because it interested him, and she was interested in everything that interested him. She understood now that he had also been teaching her to survive him. She was not certain whether that made it better or worse. She had decided it made it necessary, and that was enough. She was, at 25, precisely the woman that 6 years of invisible skilled labor had produced. Economical in her movements, exact in her reading of situations, and in possession of a patience that had been tested so many times it had become structural rather than temperamental. She did not mistake the cold corridors of Blackwood Hall for unkindness. She recognized them as what they were, a system arranged around other priorities, into which she had arrived unannounced during a dinner party. She could manage a system. She had been doing it for years. What she had not expected was the Duke of Blackwood. He had read her file 3 times. The first time was the morning the solicitor's letter arrived, informing him that his ward, the arrangement contracted 15 years ago with a man named Voss whom he had met once, at his father's insistence, over a matter of some political significance that no longer applied, was intending to take up the standing offer of residence at Blackwood Hall. He had read it, registered it as an administrative matter, and set it aside. The second time was that evening. He read it again, because something in it had not resolved correctly. The letter mentioned that Miss Voss had managed her father's estate for 6 years following his death. It mentioned this as a passing detail, in the way that one might note a woman's eye color, incidental, not explanatory. The Duke of Blackwood, whose name was William Harwood and who had held the title for 9 years, since the death of his own father, found that he could not locate the passage in the file that explained how a woman of no household staff and no independent income had managed a mortgaged estate for 6 years and delivered it to the cousin in Dorset in a condition the cousin described as surprisingly sound. He sent a letter to Mr. Parrish. The third time he read the file was after Mr. Parrish's reply arrived, which was 11 days later and considerably more detailed than he had expected. Mr. Parrish was 71 years old and had the particular frankness of a man who had run out of reasons to be diplomatic. He wrote that Miss Voss had, in 6 years, reduced the estate's outstanding debt by 63%, renegotiated 4 of the 7 active tenant agreements, and recovered £54 from a wool merchant through a documented dispute that he, Mr. Parrish, had not known was possible to make. He wrote that he had reviewed her correspondence files and that the quality of her creditor letters was, in his professional opinion, equivalent to or exceeding that of any solicitor he had employed in the past decade. He wrote that the cousin in Dorset had inherited a going concern rather than a liability, and that this outcome was entirely the result of work he had not asked for, work no one had asked for, work done by a woman who was at the time of the estate's settlement 3 months from her 25th birthday and the expiration of the wardship arrangement. William read this letter twice and then set it down on his desk and looked out the window at the grounds of Blackwood Hall, which were extensive and well managed, and the result of his own attentive administration over 9 years, and he thought about what it meant to keep something running when no one was watching. He knew something about that. He had been 26 when his mother died, and his father had followed her within the year, not from illness but from the particular collapse of a man who had organized his inner life around a single person and could not locate its structure once she was gone. William had watched this happen with the attentiveness of someone who had learned early that watching carefully was the safest response to the unpredictable. He had then spent 9 years rebuilding Blackwood Hall's finances, which his father's grief had not exactly ruined but had significantly disordered, and he had done this through the mechanisms of careful management, disciplined administration, and the comprehensive refusal to allow himself to be distracted from what was necessary. He had not been lonely. He had been occupied. There was a difference, or he had maintained for 9 years that there was. He arranged to see the estate accounts the evening after Eleanor arrived, not because they needed review, they had been reviewed 6 days prior, but because the library where they were kept was on the east wing, and the room he had given Eleanor was adjacent to it, and he had heard, that first night, the sound of someone moving through the library at what his pocket watch confirmed was 11 o'clock in the evening. He did not knock. He stood in the corridor and listened, and what he heard was the sound of someone pulling books from shelves and replacing them with the deliberate efficiency of a person who was not browsing, but looking for something specific. He did not knock the second night either. She was there again, later this time, and quieter. On the third night he knocked. The library door opened, and Eleanor stood there, in a dark green dressing gown, with her hair down and a book in her left hand, and the expression of someone who had been caught at nothing wrong and knew it perfectly well. "Your Grace," she said, with a composure that a woman surprised in a library at midnight by a duke had no natural right to possess. "Miss Voss," he said. He looked at the book, It was his estate ledger from 2 years prior. "You have found the accounts." "I have," she said. She opened the door wider. It was not an invitation. It was simply a practical recognition that a conversation in a doorway was not efficient. He came in. He sat in the chair across from the desk she had clearly been using, and she sat at the desk, and she put the ledger down and said, without preamble, "Your tenancy on the North Fields is being undercharged relative to the current market rate by approximately £6 per quarter. I have not seen the original agreements, so I cannot tell you whether this is intentional or whether the agreements were written before the rate adjusted, but it is worth knowing." He looked at her for a moment with the measuring attention she had noticed the first night in the corridor. "You have been here 3 weeks, he said. "Yes," she said. "But the ledger goes back 12 years. He did not smile. He was not the kind of man whose face made easy gestures. But something in his expression shifted in a way that was not nothing. "I will have the agreements pulled," he said. "The 1817 agreements are already on the desk," she said. "I found them in the cabinet to your left." He looked at the cabinet, then back at her, then at the agreements laid in precise order on the corner of the desk. He did not say anything. He simply reached across and picked up the first agreement and began to read it. They sat in the library for an hour and a quarter. At the end of that time, William Harwood had confirmed that the North tenancy had been undercharged for 4 years, as the result of an agreement written against a rate index that had since adjusted, that correcting it would add £23 annually to the estate's income, and that the woman across the desk from him had found this discrepancy in 3 weeks of unsupervised access to 12 years of accounts, while nominally a guest in his house. He did not say anything more when he left. He took the 1817 agreement with him, because it required a letter to the tenant farmer, and he was the one who would write it. He stood in the corridor outside the library for a moment after the door closed. The house was quiet. The grounds beyond the east window were dark. He went back to his own study and sat at his desk and did not immediately take out a sheet of correspondence paper. He sat for a while, with his hands flat on the desk, and thought about a woman who had been managing crises before breakfast for 6 years and had walked into his library at midnight because it was what needed doing. He thought this was, very possibly, the most useful and the most entirely unexpected thing that had happened at Blackwood Hall in 9 years. He did not examine what else it was. Not yet. The trouble arrived in November, as trouble in houses like Blackwood Hall tends to arrive, beautifully dressed and ahead of schedule. Lady Cecilia Dunmore was 23, and the daughter of a viscount, and she had been considered, by everyone who considered such things, the most probable next Duchess of Blackwood for the past 2 seasons. This was not because William had said anything to indicate it. It was because Lady Cecilia had said something to indicate it, in drawing rooms across London, and because she was beautiful in the way that made people assume she was right, and because there was no obvious counter-argument. The Duke of Blackwood needed a wife. Lady Cecilia was a wife. The logic was, to its adherents, airtight. She arrived for a fortnight's visit with her mother, a woman named Lady Dunmore who wore her social authority like a well-fitted coat, and who looked at Eleanor, on the first morning in the breakfast room, with the measuring expression of someone calibrating exactly what category of inconvenience she represented. Eleanor understood the calibration. She had seen it before. She was not afraid of it. She was simply alert to it, the way she was alert to discrepancies in account columns, because an unexamined thing could cost you something you had not budgeted for. Lady Cecilia was more direct. She came to Eleanor on the 3rd day of the visit, in the morning room, where Eleanor was working through a proposed amendment to the North tenancy agreement that William had asked her to review. "Miss Voss," she said, sitting down across the room as though she had been invited to, which she had not, "I wonder if I might ask you something." "Of course," Eleanor said, and set down her pen. "I understand you are the Duke's ward. A kind arrangement. He is very generous with such things." Lady Cecilia's tone was warm and precise, like a blade that had been carefully polished. "I suppose you will be returning to Wiltshire once the term expires? In January?" "I haven't decided," Eleanor said. "Oh," said Lady Cecilia, a small pause. "I had understood your situation was rather settled. That is, your estate has passed to a relative, hasn't it?" So there is not much to return to. Eleanor looked at her, not with anger. She did not have patience for anger, which was expensive and inexact. With the particular stillness of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that the sensation has become unremarkable. My situation is still being arranged, Eleanor said. But thank you for your interest in it. Lady Cecilia smiled and left, and Eleanor returned to the tenancy amendment. The amendment was not simple. The original North Tenancy Agreement, written in 1817, had been negotiated in good faith by a man who was no longer the estate steward, and against a rate index that had been superseded. The current tenant, a Mr. Abbott who had farmed the Northfields for 11 years, had not been informed of the discrepancy, which Eleanor's review of the correspondence files confirmed. He had been paying what the agreement required. He had also, in 3 seasons out of the past 4, improved his yield through methods that had added indirect value to the adjacent estate fields, in the form of reduced pest pressure and improved drainage on the shared boundary. Eleanor wrote this into her amendment note. She wrote that she recommended a revised rate, but that the rate should reflect Mr. Abbott's contributions to the adjacent land, and should be implemented with a 12-month notice period, rather than an immediate adjustment, both because it was fair and because it was strategically sound. A cooperative tenant on the North Fields was worth more than 23 additional pounds per quarter in recovered margin. She put the note at the top of the agreed correspondence pile on William's library desk when she was finished, and went to dress for dinner. She did not know that William read it 3 times. She did not know that he then sat in the library for a while, with his hands flat on the desk, in the way he sometimes did when he was registering something he was not yet ready to articulate. She did not know that he took the note to his estate advisor, a man named Mr. Edward Finch, who had served the Blackwood estate for 22 years, and who read it twice, and then said, with the deliberate care of a man who chose his words precisely, "Your Grace, this is the most sensibly drafted tenancy proposal I have seen in this office since your mother reviewed the Ashfield agreements in 1808. Where did it come from?" William told him. Mr. Finch was silent for a moment. "The ward?" he said. "Yes," William said. Another silence. Then Mr. Finch said, "Then she should be in the room for the November review." The November review was the quarterly meeting at which William reviewed the estate's financial position with his advisor and the senior household staff. It had never previously included anyone who was not either employed by the estate or holding the title to it. Eleanor was informed 2 days before. The footman who delivered the note to her morning room, a young man named Thomas who had been at Blackwood Hall for 8 months, and who had learned very quickly that Miss Voss's requests were the ones you actually attended to, did so with the particular directness that had become his standard communication with her. She read the note. She folded it and set it beside her tea, and went back to the letter she was drafting, because there was a letter that needed drafting, and she would address this new thing after. She had managed more complicated situations. She could manage this. There was also the matter of Lord Dunmore. He had arrived midway through the fortnight, a week into the visit, having been in London for business that he did not describe in detail. He was 61 years old, and the Viscount Dunmore, and he had the manner of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms that agreed with him. He looked at Blackwood Hall with the proprietary satisfaction of a man mentally cataloguing it against his daughter's future, and he looked at Eleanor with a brief expression that said, in its entirety, not relevant. It was Mr. Finch who told her, 3 days after Lord Dunmore arrived, what the actual conversation in the East drawing-room had been. Mr. Finch had been with the Blackwood estate long enough to understand which information required discreet relaying, and which did not. He stopped Eleanor in the corridor outside the library on a Tuesday afternoon, and said, without ceremony, "Miss Voss, Lord Dunmore has spoken to the Duke about you." Eleanor waited. "He has suggested," Mr. Finch said, with the care of a man reading from a document he found somewhat distasteful, "that the wardship arrangement creates a social ambiguity that is—" his word was inconvenient. "He suggested that your continued residence at Blackwood Hall during Lady Cecilia's visit gives the wrong impression of the Duke's intentions." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Did His Grace respond?" "He said he would consider the matter," Mr. Finch said. He paused. "I thought you should know," Because the November review is in 4 days, and I intend to have you there regardless of what Lord Dunmore considers appropriate. Eleanor looked at him. I have been at this estate for 22 years, Mr. Finch said, with the equanimity of a man who has earned the right to his opinion. I know a useful mind when I encounter one. Your tenancy note was correct on every point. The 12-month notice period was the detail that would have been missed. He nodded briefly and went about his business. Eleanor stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she straightened her spine, returned to the library, and spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing a comprehensive review of the estate's current quarterly position, so that she would not be an inconvenience in the November review, but a contribution to it. She worked until the light failed, and then she lit a candle and kept going. The door opened at 9:30. She looked up. William stood in the doorway with his coat on still, as though he had come from somewhere else, and not yet shed the evening. He looked at the spread of papers on the desk, the quarterly ledger, her notes, the Abbott agreement, the comparative figure sheets she had pulled from the 3 years prior, and then at her. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her, which had become, over the preceding weeks, a kind of natural arrangement. He did not need to be invited. You've heard about Dunmore, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had removed his gloves and set them on the arm of the chair, and he was looking at the desk in the particular way that meant he was thinking rather than seeing. I want to be clear with you, he said. The review on Thursday. I intend you to attend it. Whatever Lord Dunmore considers appropriate is not the governing principle of this estate's administration. Eleanor looked at him. He is not wrong that the arrangement is unusual, she said. No, William said. He is not wrong about that. He picked up the comparative figures she had pulled and looked at them for a moment. The 1819 wool income is lower than 1818 by £11, he said. You've flagged it. The weight calculation on the shearing contract renewed in March, she said. I believe the same adjustment that was made against the Marsh End contract was made here. I have not yet confirmed it, but the pattern is the same. He put the papers down and looked at her, with the exact attentive expression she had come to understand as his version of close focus. The look that meant he was not observing her position in the room, but the quality of what she was saying. The wool merchant's name, he said. She told him. His expression did not change, but something settled in it. He holds the contract for 3 other estates in this county, William said. Yes, Eleanor said. I know. He looked at her. You checked. The contract file was in the cabinet, she said. It listed the other parties. A pause. He reached up and adjusted his cravat, a small automatic gesture, and Eleanor registered that it had been crooked since dinner, and he had been in rooms with 30 people who had not mentioned it, and she put her pen down and said, May I? He stilled. She reached across the corner of the desk and adjusted the cravat in 3 precise movements, the kind that came from long practice with a father who dressed with care but no valet. She sat back. It has been crooked since before dinner, she said. He did not move for a moment. Then he said, with perfect evenness, How long before dinner? At least 40 minutes, she said. Perhaps longer. He said nothing. She was not certain what she expected him to say. She returned her attention to the quarterly ledger. He did not leave. He stayed in the chair across from her while she worked, reading through the Abbott agreement, and the 2 hours that passed were as quiet and as useful as any hours she had spent in the Marsh End estate office, and considerably better lit. When she finally set down her pen and closed the ledger, he stood and picked up his gloves. The wool merchant, he said at the door. I will have the contract reviewed by Finch. If the same adjustment has been made here, I intend to pursue it. £26 annually, Eleanor said. If the pattern holds and the retroactive period is 3 years, approximately 78 recovered. He looked at her from the doorway. You have already calculated it, he said. Yes, she said. He held her gaze for a moment with the kind of stillness that was not absence but decision, the stillness of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is determining what to do with it. Good night, Miss Voss, he said. Good night, Your Grace, she said. He left. She sat at the desk a moment longer, with one hand pressed briefly against the edge of the closed ledger. Then she gathered her papers, stacked them in order, and went to bed. The November review was held in the estate office on the ground floor, a room that smelled of old paper and beeswax, and the particular accumulated authority of 2 centuries of estate administration. It was attended by William, Mr. Finch, the senior household steward Mr. Crawford, the tenant liaison Mr. Habershaw, and Eleanor. Lord Dunmore was not in attendance. This was not an accident. Lady Cecilia was not in attendance either, though her presence had apparently been proposed by her mother, who had suggested to Lady Crawford, the housekeeper, who had taken Eleanor's measure in the first week, and arrived at her own private conclusion, that it might be appropriate for the future Duchess to familiarize herself with the estate's management processes. Lady Crawford had relayed this suggestion to Mr. Finch with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Mr. Finch had not relayed it to William. Eleanor opened the review with the quarterly summary she had prepared, not because she had been asked to open it, but because she had arrived first, and the documents were organized, and it was simply what you did when you were prepared, and others were still finding their seats. Mr. Crawford looked at her with mild surprise. Mr. Finch did not look surprised at all. She presented the North tenancy discrepancy, the proposed amendment with the 12-month notice period and its rationale, the flagged wool contract adjustment, and a third item she had found in her final 2 days of preparation. A minor discrepancy in the grain storage cost reporting, not significant in isolation, but when set beside the wool calculation and the tenant rate, suggestive of a pattern in the way 3 of the estate's contracts had been managed since 1817. She presented all 3 without raising her voice. She had brought the documents. She placed them in order on the table, and walked through each one with the unhurried precision of someone who has had 6 years of practice, presenting unpleasant financial truths to people who would have preferred not to hear them. When she finished, Mr. Habershaw, who had been looking at the wool contract figures with increasing attention, said, "If this is the same merchant, and the same method, he has done it to 4 estates." 5. Eleanor said, "I found a reference to the Harcastle contract in the 3rd cabinet file. I have not reviewed it, but the language was similar." A silence fell over the room. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of people revising their understanding of the situation they were in. Mr. Finch said, "The Harcastle contract is with Lord and Lady Harcastle." He glanced at William, who was sitting at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface, and his expression revealing nothing. "Who were at your dinner in October?" "Yes," William said. Another silence. "This is not," Mr. Finch said, carefully, "a small matter." "No," Eleanor said. "If the pattern holds across 5 estates for 3 years, the recovered sum across the county is substantial, and the merchant's method is documented. The weight calculation discrepancy is written into the contracts. It is not ambiguous." William looked at her. He had not spoken much during the presentation. He had read each document as she set it down, with the focused attention she had come to recognize, and he had asked 2 precise questions and let her answer them without amendment. He said now, "Finch, what is the process for bringing this to the relevant parties?" "An investor council," Mr. Finch said immediately. "The 5 affected estates, their solicitors, the merchant and his contract guarantor. You would need to call it formally, in the new year." "Then call it," William said. He looked at Eleanor. "You will attend." It was not a question, but it was something. She had learned to read what things were when they were not clearly labeled. "Yes," she said. Lord Dunmore left Blackwood Hall on a Friday. Before he left, he requested a private meeting with William in the East drawing room, which William attended and which lasted 20 minutes, after which Lord Dunmore departed, and William went directly to the estate office, and did not come out until dinner. Eleanor did not ask what was said. She did not need to. She had been in enough rooms where her presence was considered structurally inconvenient to understand the nature of the conversation without a transcript. She was in the morning room when William found her, 2 days later, working on a letter to Mr. Parrish in Wiltshire that had nothing to do with Blackwood Hall. He came in and sat down and said, without preamble, "Lord Dunmore suggested I remove you from the hall before the new year." Eleanor set down her pen. He was not entirely wrong about the irregularity of the arrangement, William said. A ward of 25 in residence during, he used the word courtship, which I have not confirmed as an accurate description of the situation. Eleanor said nothing. What he was wrong about, William continued, with the careful steadiness of a man reading from something he has already decided, is the assumption that my primary obligation in this matter is to what makes the arrangement look correct. It is not. My obligation is to what is correct. And what is correct is that you have identified £4,000 in annual margin across this estate, and 4 others, using 12 years of accounts and 6 weeks of your time, and I am not going to send you back to Bath before January, because a viscount found it inconvenient. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. 4 estates, she said. The Hardcastle contract still needs to be confirmed. 4 estates confirmed, he said, without missing a beat. 5 probable. She picked up her pen. Then she set it down again and said, "What will you tell Lady Cecilia?" A pause. It was, she thought, a fair question. It was also the kind of question that only made sense to ask if you already knew something about the weight of the answer. "Nothing that is not accurate," he said, "which is that there is no courtship. There never was. I am sorry if she was led to believe otherwise." He stood. He was at the door when he said, without turning around, "The Investor Council will be the 14th of January. You should have a complete presentation prepared. Every affected estate, every documented instance, the full 3-year retroactive calculation." "I already have it at 2/3, Eleanor said. He did not quite smile, but something in his posture when he left the room was different from how it had been when he came in. The Investor Council was held on the 14th of January in the formal dining room of Blackwood Hall, the same room where the chandelier-lit dinner had blazed on the night Eleanor arrived. The chandeliers were still lit. The flowers were not there, having been replaced by a long table covered in correspondence folders, and the people arranged around it were 5 estate representatives: William for Blackwood, Lord Hardcastle, a Sir James Ashford, a Mr. Peel for a 4th estate, and the solicitor for the Dunmore estate, notably, not Lord Dunmore himself, plus Mr. Finch, 2 other estate advisors, the wool merchant's contract guarantor, and a man Eleanor had not seen before who turned out to be the merchant's own solicitor, arrived with the defensive composure of someone who had been told there was a problem but had not yet seen the documentation. Eleanor was the only woman in the room. She had worn the grey wool dress. It was the right dress for the occasion, not for its aesthetics but for its clarity. She was not performing anything. She was presenting. She had 29 separate documents organized into 4 groups: the contracted weight calculation methodology, the comparison against the accurate market standard, the estate-by-estate recovery calculation, and the proposed resolution framework. Each group was tabbed. Each document was annotated in her precise, unhurried hand. She had made 5 copies of the full set, bound in order, 1 for each estate representative. She had learned, managing Marsh End, that you did not give people information you wanted them to believe. You gave them their own information, organized so that they could not avoid what it showed. She distributed the folders at the start of the meeting, before anyone had said anything substantive. The merchant's solicitor looked at his copy with the expression of someone who has just understood that the conversation they prepared for was not the conversation about to happen. She stood. She had never testified before a room like this. She had negotiated with creditors at a desk, argued with wool merchants by letter, presented accounts to a solicitor who had already known what they contained. This was different. She began. She presented the contracted methodology first. The wool merchant's contracts specified a weight calculation process that, on its face, appeared standard. She read the relevant clause aloud, slowly and without inflection, and then she read the market standard clause that had been in force since 1815, and she placed both on the table side by side without commentary, and let the room read them. The room read them. Sir James Ashford, a man of 60 who had the particular weathered expression of someone who had managed his own estate for a long time and was not pleased about what he was seeing, said, "These are different." "Yes," Eleanor said, "by a margin that, applied across all contracted weigh-ins since 1817, accounts for the discrepancy in annual income I will present next." She presented it, estate by estate, year by year, in exact figures. Not approximations. The exact figures, verified against the payment records she had matched from the available accounts for each estate. For Blackwood she had the full 3 years. For Hardcastle she had 2 years confirmed, and 1 year inferred from a payment letter in the files. For the remaining 3 estates she had the contracted amounts and the market standard differential, clearly distinguished from the confirmed figures. She stated clearly which figures were confirmed and which were inferred, and why, and what additional documentation would be needed to confirm the inferred amounts. This, she had found in 6 years of creditor negotiations, was the thing that made people trust what you were telling them, not telling them only what served you, but telling them exactly what you knew and exactly what you didn't, so that they could verify for themselves and find that your stated uncertainty was accurate. The room was very quiet. The merchant's solicitor began an objection, something about the interpretation of the contracted methodology, and Eleanor set in front of him the correspondence she had found in Blackwood Hall's third cabinet file, in which the merchant's own representative had written, in 1817, a letter explaining the calculation method to the previous estate steward. The letter used language that matched the market standard, not the contracted clause. The 2 documents were directly contradictory. She said so. She said it without anger. She said it the way she said everything, precisely and completely, with the documents on the table, so that anyone in the room could read them and arrive at the same conclusion she had. The solicitor looked at the letter and did not attempt another objection. Lord Hardcastle said, in a voice that had the quality of a man revising his map of a place he thought he knew, "How much? Across all 5 estates?" "Confirmed, £312 annually, representing approximately £936 over 3 years, across 4 estates," Eleanor said. "Probable, pending confirmation, an additional £62 annually for the Dunmore estate, based on contract structure. The total retroactive settlement, if all 5 estates participate, and the 3-year period is confirmed, is in the range of £1,122. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, not with noise, with the complete and spreading clarity of something that cannot be undone once it has been seen. It was William who spoke first, from his seat at the head of the table. He said, "The proposed resolution framework is in the 4th section of your folders. I would ask the room to read it before we proceed to discussion." The room read it. Eleanor had written the resolution framework herself, over 2 nights in the library in January. It provided for the merchant to repay the full retroactive settlement amount across a structured 18-month schedule, with interest calculated at the standard creditor rate, and for the contracts to be renegotiated against the market standard effective immediately. It was not punitive. It was correct. Sir James said, "This is a fair framework." Mr. Peel said, "I want the full 3-year documentation for my estate before I sign anything." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I can have it prepared within the week." The merchant's solicitor, after a long silence, said that he would need to consult with his client. He was given until the 28th of January. The session concluded at 2:30. The room began to disperse, men collecting their folders with the particular quiet of people who have understood something they would have preferred not to understand, and are now deciding what to do with it. Lord Hardcastle stopped beside Eleanor on his way out. He was 63 years old, and had the look of a man who did not say things he did not mean. He said, "Miss Voss, the annotated ledger you prepared for this presentation, would your methodology be available for other estates to review? I have had this merchant's contract since 1816. "I will send you the review template," Eleanor said. "It will allow your own steward to conduct the verification." He nodded. He looked at her once more, with the expression of a man reclassifying something he had placed in the wrong category. Then he left. Mr. Finch gathered his papers at the end of the table and looked at Eleanor with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been correct about something for some time and has now been publicly vindicated. He said nothing. He nodded, and it contained everything. She was gathering her own documents when she heard the room go still behind her. She turned. William was standing in the center of the room, which was now empty except for the 2 of them, and he was looking at her with the measuring, attentive expression she had first seen in the corridor on the night of the dinner party. but something in it had changed, or had been added to, in a way that she could not immediately categorize. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and he took her right hand from where it rested against the stack of folders, and he held it, not a clasp, not a formal greeting, but a hold, deliberate and unhurried, and then he bowed, and he pressed his lips to the back of her hand, with the formality of a man who is doing something public in an empty room because it is what the moment requires. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She was not going to cry, she was not made of that, but she pressed the hand he released briefly against her side, before she went back to stacking her papers, and the pressure of it carried. He said, "When you have a moment. Tonight, if you are free." "I will be in the library," she said. He came to the library at 9 o'clock. He closed the door. He did not sit in the chair across the desk. He stood, which was new, and she sat with her hands folded on the closed ledger and looked at him. He said, "I am going to say something that has a practical dimension, which I want to name first, so that the practical dimension does not obscure what I intend." She waited. "The practical dimension is this," he said. "Your wardship expires in 3 weeks. You have demonstrated, over the past 12 weeks, a capacity for estate management that is not common and not accidental. I have had advisors for 20 years, and not one of them found the wool calculation in 12 years of accounts. Finch would like you to remain in an advisory capacity. That is one available arrangement." He paused. "The other arrangement," he said, "is not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements my position imposes upon me. It is not because of the council today, though the council demonstrated something I already knew. It is because in 12 weeks I have not once walked into the library without finding it a better room than it was before you came into it, and because you straightened my cravat and told me it had been crooked for 40 minutes without apology and without softening it, and because you chose, in a morning room with no one watching, not to become smaller than you were." He looked at her. "I would like you to remain, not as a ward, as my wife, if you are willing. I am asking because I would like you to be willing, and not for any other reason." Eleanor sat very still with her hands on the ledger. She thought about it, not briefly, not as a performance of deliberation, but actually, the way she thought about every decision that mattered. She thought about what it cost, and what it meant, and what it would require of her. She thought about 12 years of accounts, and the North tenancy, and the wool merchant, and a man who had stood in the corridor outside this library for 3 nights before he knocked. She thought about the kind of attention that was not admiration but recognition, and what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it after a very long time. She looked up. "Yes," she said. It was January when Eleanor Voss became Eleanor Harwood, in a small ceremony at the parish church that served the Blackwood estate, attended by Mr. and Mrs. Finch, the 3 Habershaw daughters who served as informal witnesses, Mr. Parrish, who had come up from Wiltshire, because Eleanor had written him a letter that he told her afterward he had read 4 times, and a woman named Charlotte Pierce, who had been introduced to Eleanor by Mrs. Finch in the 3rd week of November, and who had arrived at the wedding in an incorrect shade of green, and kissed Eleanor's cheek, and said, "You are the most sensible person I have ever met, and I intend to remain your friend permanently." Lady Cecilia Dunmore married a baronet in the spring, and was, by all accounts, content. Eleanor did not know her well enough to be certain of this, but she thought it probably true. The system had worked for Lady Cecilia in the end, as it was designed to. That was not a tragedy. It was simply not Eleanor's story. Lord Dunmore had sent, before his departure from Blackwood Hall in November, a brief note to William that William showed Eleanor 3 months later. The note said, "I was wrong about the ward. I was not wrong about the irregularity. I allow that these are different things." William had kept the note. He showed it to Eleanor with the equanimity of a man who had long since stopped needing Lord Dunmore's opinion. Eleanor read it and returned it, and said nothing beyond. He is not wrong that they are different things. It was, she thought, the most she was going to get, and it was enough. The wool merchant settled on the 25th of January, 3 days before the deadline, through his solicitor, at the full retroactive amount. The resolution framework Eleanor had written became the template for the renegotiation of all 5 contracts. Sir James Ashford's solicitor wrote to Eleanor in February, to request the review template for 2 additional merchant contracts his estate held. She sent it with annotations. The Blackwood estate's quarterly revenue, by the end of their first full year of marriage, had increased by £412 over the prior year. Eleanor had been precise about projecting 390. The additional 22 came from a drainage improvement on the Southfield boundary that she had identified in March, and proposed to William over dinner. He had approved it the next morning, which was how most of their decisions were made. She reviewed the situation. She made a recommendation. They discussed it with the directness of 2 people who had been in a library at midnight together, enough times to be past performance. And then one of them acted. It was not a partnership that anyone had exactly predicted, but then, no one had predicted Eleanor. Their daughter was born in the second winter, and they named her Catherine, for William's mother. She had Eleanor's eyes and William's hands, and the particular temperament of a child who noticed everything, and said very little, which both her parents recognized without comment. She learned to walk in the East Corridor, and to read in the library, which was her mother's library now, in every way that mattered. The 12 years of accounts joined by 3 new volumes in Eleanor's hand, and a growing shelf of reference texts that neighboring estates had begun, quietly and without announcement, to borrow. On a morning in the 3rd year, Eleanor was at the estate desk in the library, reviewing the proposed terms of a new wool contract, the replacement merchant, properly vetted, when Catherine escaped the nursery maid and came running down the corridor at a speed that was frankly remarkable for a child of 18 months, and burst through the library door and wrapped herself around Eleanor's ankle with an expression of complete triumph. William, who had come to find Eleanor because it was 8:30 and she had not been at breakfast, appeared in the doorway behind his daughter. He stood there, watching Eleanor lift Catherine with one arm, and set her on her hip while she held the contract draft in the other hand, and kept reading. He watched the way Eleanor's hand, without looking, found Catherine's back and held her steady. He watched his daughter put her head down on Eleanor's shoulder, with the confidence of a creature who had never doubted she was exactly where she should be. Eleanor looked up and saw him watching. "She needs breakfast," Eleanor said, "and the merchant has added a clause in subsection 4 that we need to discuss." "I know," he said. He was still watching her. "William," she said. "Yes," he said. She gave him a look that was not impatience but something adjacent to it, the look of a woman who had places to be, and things to do, and did not require being observed to feel their significance. He came in. He took Catherine, who went to him with the same confidence she had brought to Eleanor's ankle, and he tucked her against his shoulder, and he said, "Show me the clause." Eleanor smoothed the contract on the desk and showed him. They stood together at the desk, the 3 of them in the library that smelled of old paper and beeswax, and the accumulated evidence of 6 years, and a life built from the specific material of work, done well and attention paid fully. And Eleanor traced the line of the suspect clause with her finger, and began to explain what it cost, and what it meant, and what she intended to do about it. He listened. He always listened, and Catherine, held against her father's shoulder, reached out one small hand and grabbed the corner of the contract, and Eleanor, without missing a word, gently extracted it and continued.